It's a pleasure to host Professor Ayelet and Yishai, or Minerva Seminar. Ayelet is the chair of the English department at our university, and specializes in post-colonial and Victorian literature and culture and the history of the novel. And I think what brings her to us is that she wrote a lot, and she researched a lot. The concept of emergency in India, as reflected also in the literature, just published a book, Oxford University Press, on engineers of emergency crisis and continuity in Indian writing in English. And so it's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Minerva Center. I'd like to thank Michal, first of all, for giving me a small grant that aided in the publication of this book, so yay. And then also for inviting me to talk today. Can I ask you to, just so I can see you without, like maybe move over there or something, and then it would be more sort of forward facing. Thank you. So Ellie said that I've written about and studied the concept of emergency in India, but it's not so much the concept as it centers around an actual real emergency, state of emergency in India, and which I will talk about in just a few minutes. But first I will start, and I'm sorry, this has become a cliche in and of itself, I'll start with the COVID pandemic. So the COVID pandemic had brought a renewed consideration of states of emergency, employed variously worldwide to combat the global health crisis. In many of these countries of the pandemic, India prominent among them, the emergency measures sat far too easily with ongoing erosions of democratic government and governance. The severe limitations to individual and collective rights carried out for the sake of the public health seem oddly of a piece with those already in place in the name of security or public safety. The harsh and hastily imposed lockdown that left millions of migrant workers to their gruesome fate resonated with the anti-Muslim riots in New Delhi in February 2020, which in turn followed on the heels of the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act, the Chok-e-Laom of India, and other authoritarian measures instituted by what is increasingly called the undeclared emergency led by the ruling BJP party. Emergency measures that seem to form an amalgam of crisis and of continuity, a nexus that forms the relationship of the emergency to its past. Indeed, emergency situations in India and around the world have always presented a complicated and ostensibly paradoxical mix of crisis and continuity, of an anomaly that is both a contrast to the ordinary and at the same time part of a chronic situation. Arguing that the state of exception has become the new normal has by now become a cliche in itself. However, rather than pointing out that the state of emergency is mundane, although it is, or that it is rooted in a colonial structure, though it also is, I'm trying to pay attention to how it functions simultaneously as exceptional and non-exceptional, to talk about the emergency not only as an event and a crisis, but also as a figure for the corrupt, chronic condition of Indian democratic society and culture in the late 20th century. In my book, and in my talk today, I propose thinking of emergencies as a genre, a set of socially agreed upon conventions that have coalesced into a category. A genre is a complicated mixture of the singular and the general, where each individual text is unique, but draws on and manifests a series of conventions that make it understandable as part of a category. At the same time, each individual text or work of art or event also inflects and influences the genre or genres of which it is part. This five-part talk will begin with a brief recap of the history of the emergency, and then a short reading of two very different emergency texts. I hope to convince you that understanding the emergency as a genre will hopefully show you how we can think through literature about politics, and also that the thinking about emergency as genre allows us to think through the paradox of crisis and continuity that characterizes the 1975 emergency, the capital E emergency in India, as well as, in the final part, the various states of emergency potentially or actually in effect in our world today and right here now. Okay, part one, history. In June 1975, the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi famously imposed a state of emergency throughout the country in response to what she called the deep and widespread conspiracy against her. The immediate trigger was a court ruling invalidating Gandhi's election due to misconduct in her 1971 campaign. We can talk about that later. It's an amazing fact in and of itself. More generally, Gandhi's increasing power and authoritarianism had prompted the rise of oppositional forces led by one of her fathers, Nehru, India's first prime minister, yes, who was Indira Gandhi's father, one of her father's closest friends, a universally loved former independence activist, Jai Prakash Narayan, known as JP. Threatened by these oppositions, Gandhi acted swiftly and ruthlessly. Across the country, tens of thousands were detained without trial and sent to jail, where many were tortured. JP and other oppositional leaders from the left and from the right were also arrested. Basic civil liberties were suspended. Elections for the parliament and state governments were postponed. The constitution was amended. Freedom of the press was suspended. I mean, you see where this is going. Heavy censorship imposed. Houses and bazaars were demolished in the name of slum eradication or beautification. And finally, and perhaps most horrifically, Gandhi's son Sanjay Gandhi led a widespread forced sterilization campaign targeting many of the nation's poor and indigent, millions of them. The emergency ended as abruptly as it began. In January 1977, the Prime Minister astonished the nation yet again when she decided to dissolve Parliament and call for new elections, in which she was roundly defeated in those elections. Gandhi's surprising return to power soon after, in 1980, her son Sanjay's death a few months later, her assassination in 1984, hastened the desire to forget the period, which was swiftly relegated to the status of anomaly in India's democratic history, surfacing from time to time, most recently during the authoritarian regime of Prime Minister Modi, today meeting with our foreign minister, and the COVID pandemic. To see how this played out in its Anglophone fiction, we first turn to Rohinton Mysteries, so starting with fiction, Rohinton Mysteries' internationally successful novel, A Fine Balance. Anyone here read it by any chance? All right. Which takes place during the state of emergency. Ishvar and his nephew Chamars, so lower caste or outcasts who try to escape caste violence in their village, are apprenticed to become tailors by a Muslim family friend from a neighboring village who they call Ashraf Chacha, so uncle. The two then move to Bombay to work as tailors, where they're caught up in the horrors of the emergency, including the demolition of the slum in which they live. In the novel's climax, Ishvar and return to Ashraf Chacha's village, are captured and sent to a sterilization camp. In retribution for defiantly spitting at the local racketeer who had murdered his father, is castrated. Ishvar undergoes the Nusmandi, the vasectomy operation, but the sterilization operation, simple and painless according to the government spokesman, goes terribly wrong. Gangrene spreads through Ishvar's legs, which are duly amputated. By the time they return from the camp, and Ishvar discover that their friend and benefactor, Ashraf Chacha, has been beaten to death. And yet the trains throughout this time are on time, creating an evident tension between the emergency, by definition a time of crisis, of irregular and unusual event, and the stable, recurring regularity of the train's strange punctuality. Indeed, the entire chapter narrating these utmost horrors, climactic even within this really unrelenting novel, is permeated with an odd sense of regularity, stability, commensurality, and cyclicality. The chapter begins, appropriately enough, with the arrival of the train carrying and Ishvar into town. To their surprise, their friend is there to meet them. "How did you know we were coming today?" "I didn't," he smiled, "but I knew it would be this week, and the train rolls in at the same hour every day." This image of Chacha at the railway station establishes the iterative mood of the entire chapter, where an event described only once evokes a regular repetition of the same event. Ironically, it is the image of the train on time only during the emergency, which establishes the anticlimactic, anti-emergency tone of this chapter and even of this novel as a whole. Curiously, against the resigned, iterative background, the emergency does not create a sharp contrast. In fact, it just seems like more of the same. Market day was noisier than usual because the Family Planning Center was promoting its sterilization camp from a booth in the square. In other words, it was always noisy on market day, and the emergency just makes it a little bit more so. More broadly, and yet following a similar logic, the emergency only slightly exacerbates the already difficult lives of the lower castes. The novel implies that the poor and disenfranchised have always been at the mercies of the powers that rule them. For them, it is immaterial whether the violence which oppresses them originates from the local landlords, zamindar, as it has from time immemorial, or from the central government in New Delhi, as it does now during the emergency. In a fine balance, the urgency of the emergency and its horrors seems to be subsumed under the sign of the ordinary. Despite the changes sweeping the country under emergency, things in fact stay the same. Mystery creates a realist narrative, writing in the genre of the prosaic, the ordinary, the day-to-day, and also the dominant genre of the Indian novel in the 1970s. By choosing realism for his novel, Mystery signals a generic return to the 1970s, and also one that foregrounds the ongoing malaise and problems undergirding the emergency rather than the singular crisis by which it was known. Mystery pairs the horrific and dramatic content of emergency violence and excess with the most ordinary, uncataclysmic of forms, thus performing the tension between crisis and continuity to understand the chronic, ordinary problems of Indian democracy via a return to the extraordinary. Part 3, nonfiction. So moving from emergency fiction to nonfiction, I'd like to foreground a different form of continuity within crisis. That which links the current, ostensibly unprecedented emergency of 1975, not with the everyday, but with previous emergencies. Here we encounter Shanta Kumar. In 1975, he was a member of the Himachal Pradesh Legislative Assembly from the oppositional Bharatiya Janata Party, the forerunner of the BJP, but we'll get to that. Kumar, like thousands of other members of Gandhi's political opposition, was arrested in the first days of the emergency and spent the rest of its days in jail under administrative or preventative detention. While in jail, he, like many others imprisoned before and with him, wrote a diary. The prison memoir is a very important Indian genre, one that is intimately tied to the formation of a modern national Indian subject, right? Gandhi wrote memoirs from jail. Nehru did. Everyone did, right? It was important in national Indian genre. And of course, it's tied to colonial rule. Indeed, Nasser Hussain has showed that the colonial problem of emergency has continued both implicitly and explicitly into the colonial period and into the nationalist state. This is evident in Kumar's diary, which repeats many of the same themes and motifs that populate colonial-era prison narratives. At times, Kumar also makes this comparison explicit. For example, when describing his surveillance by police while on leave, he writes, "Had the British been ruling, I would probably not have felt as suffocated. But in free India, innocent patriots were being shadowed like criminals. I couldn't stand it." Recasting the emergency in colonial terms was part also of a larger tendency to fuse the current crisis with colonial continuity. More concretely, presenting the emergency as a second freedom struggle, the legacy of political imprisonment to Indian independence was never far from mind. Also significant that the prison memoir was not only a colonial genre, but also a colonial genre, by which I mean that it functions not only as a mode of representation, what it says about life in prison, but also as a set of conventions and expectations, right? So the prison memoir presents a set of conventions and expectations within which its form and content garners meaning. In other words, no matter its context or its contents, a genre already carries with it, this is one of my main arguments, a certain set of meanings just by virtue of its form. To understand the importance of writing about incarceration as a genre, consider the following, in which Kumar describes a previous imprisonment in 1953 at the age of 17 for a satyagraha, sit-in, an oppositional movement in favor of the annexation of Jammu and Kashmir. Note that the colonial prison narratives provided for Kumar a model for patriotic political behavior and values. I had left the staggering financial conditions of my family, my ailing sister, and my 17-day-old job behind, thinking that Kashmir was the crown of India and therefore anything could be sacrificed for it. But the lofty patriotic ideals were shaken by the narrow, smelling cell in the police station, coupled with the insulting behaviors of the police. I then recollected the episodes of Indian revolutionaries in British jails, which I had read as a child and felt strengthened. Note the doubling up of genre. Kumar presents a memoir writing about a memoir. One can only imagine that he is imagining the children who will one day be strengthened by his own narrative. We might also note that this passage, in fact, refers to 3 different incarcerations with 3 very different legal contexts, right? So the first is his emergency detention, from which he is narrating the story in 1975, which was administrative detention under MISA, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, right? Emergency legislation. The second is his 1953 arrest as a 17-year-old, about which he reminisces here, which was under the Indian Penal Code. He was tried there, he was arrested, he was sentenced to prison to a short time prison and a small fine, but this was under, which was a unlawful assembly carrying a weapon. Section number 144. And then the third, so right, we have the emergency, we have the previous one, which is the penal code, and then the earliest incarceration is not his incarceration, but the pre-1947 incarcerations of Indian revolutionaries, obviously incarcerated under colonial emergency regulations. to which he refers here and from which he receives his inspiration. These three incarcerations conflate three different moments in modern Indian history, a conflation I want to continue to explore here. What do I mean? This temporal laying and conflation indexes the political sleight of hand that Kumar is attempting in this diary. Though he never says so explicitly, Kumar was an operative of the RSS and a member of its political arm, the Bharatiya Jana Sangh. The RSS was then and is to this day a powerful Hindu nationalist organization, established in the mid-1920s as an anti-colonial and continues to this day as an anti-Muslim organization set to form a Hindu Rashtra, Hindu nation, also known as Hindutva. In the early decades of independence, the RSS, staunchly anti-secular, secular in India, by the way, means it means equal citizenship. It doesn't mean a level of religiosity. It means secular means sort of the state of all its citizens, right? Not a preference of one religion or one community of another. So that's important to note, right? So the RSS, staunchly anti-secular and anti-Congress. Congress was the main party in India from 1947, the ruling party until 1977, when Gandhi lost the election after the emergency. So anti-secular, anti-Congress was maligned and marginalized, even banned in 1948 after one of its former members assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, right? Again, over his supposedly pro-Muslim stand, over partition. And so Kumar's conflation of the various temporal layers of his diary, the independence struggle with reference to the Gandhian satyagraha, the Kashmir protests that led to 1953 imprisonment, and his later detention during the emergency period, serves to establish himself as a patriot and to blur his move from the scarred margins of Indian politics to its center. Okay? Kumar thus positions himself as a patriot, not only in opposition to Indira Gandhi and her emergency rule, but also to her father's Nehru's government and to the Indian secular state. As we have already seen, the genre of the post-colonial prison memoir primarily and explicitly recasts the post-colonial emergency regime as colonial rule redux. But the reference to 1953 reminds us that Kumar, without a trace of irony, is glossing over an important difference. Unlike the colonial past in which nationalism was in opposition to the colonial state, here in the nationalist post-colonial context, incarceration by the state is recast as a mark of patriotism to the state. The nationalist state is thus split into two, where the nation and the state, right, the nation, the desired Hindu nation, right, and the state, the Congress Raj, are no longer identical. And patriotism to the nation means opposing the state. At stake, Kumar realizes, is the discursive ownership of the nation. This is how he describes him. On a burning flame of the nation, a few patriots have always sacrificed themselves like the proverbial patanga. The history of the country was written on the heroic acts of these few patriots. I was flying high on the wings of patriotism. While Kumar is flying high on patriotism, he is in fact doing so on the wings of his opponents, creating a hitherto unthinkable continuity between Mahatma Gandhi and an RSS operative, casting the first 28 years of Indian independence as a state at odds with its nation. And so, while the diary does not lay out much of a political agenda, it masterfully uses the genre of the prison memoir to recast Kumar and fellow detainees as Gandhi's successors, patriotic fighters for a free India, fighting against an illegitimate state. Emergency detention was, and remains to this day, undoubtedly an anti-democratic political practice under whose auspices extreme state violence, including torture, were carried out. At the same time, it also here afforded as it did for earlier colonial détenus, a political boon to a certain class of prisoners whose incarceration paved their way to a political career. While I'm no way arguing that Kumar or other detainees welcomed the emergency or their imprisonment under its regime, they most emphatically did not, I do want to argue that the anti-colonial struggle for independence had supplied them with a political template, one which they, to a certain extent unknowingly, exploited for their individual and political gain. And Kumar became chief minister afterwards of Himachal Pradesh. He was a member of parliament and had long and still alive, but a long political career. Kumar thus establishes himself and his political party with a long lineage of political prisoners in Indian colonial post-colonial history, despite being their political opponent, using the conventions of genre to create a hitherto unthinkable continuity between Mahatma Gandhi and an RSS political operative. Okay, so genres of emergency. What are the genres of emergency? The overall argument of my book is twofold. First, that the meanings of the 1975-1977 emergency in India, for its various constituents at the time and for those seeking to understand it after the fact, were predicated on a tension between crisis and continuity. Second, that this tension was worked out in its literary and non-literary text through an explicit awareness and engagement with these genres. By way of explanation, I want to explain how I came about this argument. So I want to talk you through kind of what I did over 9 years. Okay, so having identified a corpus of emergency novels in English, these are most of the novels, the major novels that I talk about in the book. The crisis and continuity argument came first, evident in the rhetoric of its time, right, in politician speeches and memoirs and historical accounts, and in the fiction written long after its end. These are all novels written after the emergency and 2000, right? So the latest one is 1996.
And they refer to the emergency?
Yes, they all in one way or another, and we can talk about that later, but they all in one way or another are about the emergency or a fictionalized version of the emergency, but are identifiable as a right? So I first saw the crisis and continuity. That was kind of the easier part. It became very evident in the beginning. In other words, it became evident that the literary discourse on the emergency, like its event, straddles the tension between the singular and the generic, between the unprecedented and the always already. The second part of my argument about genre took longer and began somewhat arbitrarily when I wrote a grant application, not the one from Minerva, but I think it was the ISF one. And I needed to say what chapters the book would have. So so the need to organize the novels into chapter led me to the realization that most emergency fiction written in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was written in one of 4 genres, right? And I said, okay, that's a good way to put them into chapters. Right, is the chapters, realism, epic, allegory, and thriller, or in strong relation to one of those 4 genres, or more of them. Some actually work with more than one genre. This organization allowed me to see that the authors of emergency take seriously the genres in which they write and use them to mobilize literary conventions as political interventions. Okay. More specifically, these novels use the conventions of realism, of epic, of allegory, and of the thriller to reach back in time and across cultures and languages, right? These are genres that exist across cultures and languages, invoking past iterations of these genres in history and anticipating those to come. I finally came to understand the ways that genre in these novels was working not just a formal representational category or literary trend, but rather as a vehicle for as a vehicle for densely coded cultural historical knowledge which the novel sought to engage, whether implicitly or explicitly. Some of you may know Hayden White's famous exploration of the relationship between history and history, politics, and narrative modes. But unlike Hayden White, I do not claim that these four genres are particularly suited to the representations of the emergency, though they may well be. That's just not the kind of argument that I'm making. Nor is my argument about realism, epic, allegory, and thriller as discrete, identifiable literary categories. I'm not interested in creating a taxonomy, not how I read literature. Instead, I ask what these novels do with their genres through their engagement with their genres. The answer I came to is that genre itself affords emergency fiction a uniquely effective form of historicization. By its very structure, genre indexes previous iterations of the form, condensing historical knowledge and perspective, asking that its newest iteration, the latest novel, be read in light of its precedent, the predecessors. So if you're reading a novel and it's of a certain genre, you're also implicitly bringing with you to the novel the history of this genre, other novels in this genre, and that's cultural knowledge that gets coded into the genre. Genre thus functions as a malleable, historically saturated form. In other words, genre functions not only as a mode of representation, what we look through, right, but also as a conceptual object, what we look at. A set of conventions and expectations condensed over time within which its form and content garners meaning. For example, as I showed with relation to mystery above in the novel that we read, I argue that since realism has come to be associated with the mundane and the quotidian, it is a way to situate the emergency within a discourse of the normal and thus to raise questions about the relationship of the political crisis to the stagnating colonial and post-colonial structures which enabled it. And yet, genre as object can also, of course, simply lead to a reification of that object, by which genre ceases to function actively and critically, and instead serves to reaffirm expectations, right? This is when genre becomes generic, right? It becomes generic, we become habituated to it, it becomes reified, it's not a critical move. This insight brings me to the final part of this talk, where I hope to bring my research to bear on our own emergencies today. The last stages of writing genres of emergency coincided with a global emergency in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic, if you remember. As I was revising these chapters and coalescing them into a book while under lockdown at home, the connections between my research and my surroundings came fast and strong. Reflected in the emergency pandemic, reflected in the pandemic emergency, it became clearer in my study that emergencies worldwide are not only similar to past emergencies, but that they are constructed on a template of emergency, a structure within which an emergency could be comprehended despite its ostensible singularity. In other words, emergencies are unprecedented, but they need to be recognizably so. My work in fictional genre first allowed me to recognize the ways that non-fictional genres, from the prison memoir through the magazine report to dissident writing, similarly used genre to mediate this paradox and the political tensions it indexes. Indeed, it was genre that helped me understand the ways in which crisis and continuity trope could be harnessed by opposite ends of the political spectrum. We can talk about how both sides of the political divide in India today use the emergency for their own political needs, right? So it belongs to both. More cogently, the emergency as a genre allowed it to blur the differences between those poles, as we saw with Kumar. In short, just as the emergency was comprehended through the literary and non-literary genres in which it was written, so can states of emergency as events or political legal constructs be understood in terms of genre. They are, after all, construed through a similar structure or template with variation in the details of each iteration. Whether in the form of suspension of civil liberties, the bitter pill that the nation must take for its own good, fear-mongering against enemies from without or within, and we can just open the headlines in our newspapers today, right? These genres, right? The prioritization of public safety and convenience, aka the trains running on time. States of emergency are predicated on a series of tropes that mediate the unprecedented and the always already. Rushdie, Salman Rushdie, in his emergency novel, Midnight's Children, which ends with the emergency, put it perfectly as he. So Rushdie captures this, the thing that, like the knee-jerk reaction to emergency, right? Emergency as genre, he says. The word of urgency was being heard for the first time, and suspension of civil rights, and the censorship of the press, and the armored units on special alert, and arrest of subversive elements, right? Continues, right? But you see how what he captures with the dashes between the words is how these come as ready-made templates, right? We know we hear emergency and everything kicks in. So if the danger of literary genre as object is reification, as I said earlier, then its correlating thinking about the state of emergency as genre is normalization. The paradox of genre is that it is necessary for comprehension. We cannot understand an event without understanding what kind of event it is. But once an event becomes an event of a certain kind, then it loses its singularity and hence its meaning as crisis. It becomes normalized. Once identified and declared, an emergency brings about an array of generically determined actions and reactions that seem inevitable and necessary. That's Rushdie, right? These in turn further normalize the state of emergency and, as I show throughout, tend to depoliticize it, right? This is just an emergency, right? It's formal. As I wrote the concluding lines of my book, the COVID-19 pandemic, then 2 years old, had become the new normal. Would it have an actual end, we wondered? It was, I think, declared this week as officially over, and or not, but not really over, right? And if it did, would we recognize it? At the same time, the global refugee crisis of the early 21st century continued and still continues unabated, building on previous already normalized one, including the ongoing displacement of Palestinians where I live and write. Imbricated in each other, historical and political genres abound. Events fade in and out of view, at times as crisis, at others as continuity. Hovering above all of these, I've tried to argue here is the genre of emergency, where the unprecedented meets the always already in the struggle to make sense of the senseless, in the fear of normalizing that which should not be normalized. Okay. So it would be, of course, be disingenuous to ignore the elephant in the room and not say a few words about the political and constitutional crisis in which we are embroiled, and to suggest my insights in an attempt to analyze it. And of course, because this is how it works, there's also the other crisis of Gaza hovering over that. So I want you to hear that as well in what I'm saying, but I'm talking about the constitutional crisis. It seems to me that we have an interesting deviation from the classic model of state-imposed emergency. Rather than emergency as a temporary imposition of authoritarian measures that somehow ended up long-term, or even worse, emergency as a cynical ruse to implement previously planned measures, here the state, in the form of Netanyahu's sixth government, is insisting that authoritarian measures being instituted are not temporary, nor are they crisis-driven. To the contrary, their stated plan is to create a new constitutional regime that is here to stay, right? We no longer have to read emergency suspiciously. What many of us experience as a constitutional crisis announces itself proudly as the new normal. In this inversion, the rhetoric of emergency is being wielded by the opposition. I will use us to talk about the opposition. I hope that's okay, who are mobilizing their resistance, our resistance, under the sign of emergency. This is where I think we should be paying attention. If we take my conceptualization of emergency as genre seriously, then we who are mobilizing under the sign of crisis have to read our own rhetoric suspiciously. This is not to say that there is no constitutional crisis, nor that we shouldn't make every effort to resist it. I most emphatically think we should. But in our focus on this crisis, we need first to question our own investment in regarding this moment as a crisis and as an emergency. Then to ask what is elided or normalized by our conceptualization of emergency. Finally, we need to take seriously the ways in which this moment is not a crisis, but a continuity. By way of explaining what I mean, I'll articulate a few questions we might want to ask ourselves. I've just argued that the declaration of emergency triggers a series of tropes that mediated the unprecedented and the always already. Tzav Shmone לדמוקרטיה, אין לי ארץ אחרת, the flag, which flag, the Declaration of Independence, the so-called opposition's leaders' immediate support for any military operation to defend the residents of the South. Right? This is the emergency that trumps an emergency. We might want to ask ourselves, what kind of Israeli polity is being imagined through these tropes? What are its sociological, cultural, and geographical contours? What difficulties, inconsistencies, differences does the emergency as genre demand that we cast aside while we first address the crisis? Are we perhaps secretly relieved to cast them aside? Who, most importantly, are we casting aside as we do so? What is the generic we being constituted here? Moreover, if the danger of the state of emergency as genre is normalization, what might we be normalizing while we are resisting? If we are arguing for a return to democracy, what does this mean for those for whom this has never been and continues not to be a democracy? Finally, since this constitutional crisis is but another far more extreme crisis in a string of emergencies, we might wonder what we have compromised and normalized thus far in each consecutive moment of crisis in the name of emergency. How are we contributing to the very ritual we are resisting, to the long-standing and escalated continuities that have enabled this very real and dangerous emergency?
Thank you very much, Ayelet. Very beautiful paper. The story of India, which I'm ignorant about, resembles very much the part of the story, our story, the frustration of the tension of the Stern Gang under the British rule, and then when they are detained by the government of Israel as Jewish terrorists, resembles the same experience. But I want to ask you a first question about the concept of emergency, because I think this is a little bit blurred. Emergency, crisis, disaster. If I look at the literature, and I'm not a literary specialist, there are many books that talks about fires, disasters, and floods. Actually, for literary purposes, almost in every book, you need to have some kind of a disaster. So I'm not sure about your concept of emergency, which is a very political orientated emergency. And, you brought the corona in. I'm not sure how it correlates to natural disasters or pandemics or other sorts of emergency, which are not on political ground, and whether you can really make your argument with regard to any kind of personal or collective or group crisis or disaster. Where do you where do you draw the lines between emergency and other kind of bad situation?
I don't care. I care, obviously, but it's not what I do to classify things as one thing or another. I'm interested, right? I'm a scholar of rhetoric, of text, right? I'm interested to see what is called an emergency by others, right? So when others hail emergency, that's what I'm interested in. So I'm not interested in classifying something as a disaster or an emergency, right? I'm interested in what happens when we call something emergency, what is hailed by that, right? What is baked into that moment, right? So that's what I'm looking at in these texts, right? So, I mean, specifically in India, I'll say a couple of things. Specifically in India, this period is known as the emergency. Right? The emergency, capital E emergency. When people say the emergency, that's what they're talking about. They could say, I have an emergency at home. I don't have childcare today. But they could also say, right? But when they say the emergency, they're talking about 1975 to 1977. That is, right? And it's true when you say, really, I'm talking about states of emergency, like the declaration, right? So if that's kind of what, but for me, what I'm interested in, and it is a political version of emergency, and that's why what I was interested in the COVID was not the public health emergency, the people dying, but the mobilization of states of emergency by governments, right? Oh, so we can do the surveillance now, no problem. Let's do cell phone surveillance, let's do lockdown, right? All of those things that we can now implement because we can now declare a state of emergency. So I'm interested in that part, right? But I'm interested in the rhetoric of emergency. Many people, when I give these talks, many people say, well, what about the climate crisis? Is that an emergency or is not an emergency? And I'd say there are many different ways of looking at that. I'm not a climate scientist, but what I'm interested in is the people who call it an emergency. What is their investment in calling something an emergency? Investment, it could be an explicit one, it could be implicit, it could be something that they talked about, right? But what am I marshaling in by calling something an emergency? That's my research question. So, and I know that that's very different from the kind of questions that you asked.
9/11 doesn't feature a lot of books, literature.
There is a huge industry of people who are writing about 9/11.
And it's not
fiction.
It's not in your.
No, because I'm writing about India.
It's only the books are only.
Yeah. The book is on India. I mean, there are a lot of and the world does not need me to write about 9/11 literature. There's a lot of literature written about 9/11. There are even more scholarship written about the fiction about 9/11. So I'm.
How did you get to it? I mean, I forgot his.
India. To India to studying India or to studying the emergency.
By the British period, because of the British period. How did you get to it?
It started. I mean, it came about. It came about in different ways. I've always traveled. I traveled in India, and whenever I travel anywhere, I try to read as much as I can. So I started reading. I read Midnight's Children not long after it came out, right? So I started reading in the 80s a lot of Indian fiction when I was there and afterwards, and I was always interested. But it wasn't professional reading. I went to law school then, but when I did make the switch to studying literature, and I went to Berkeley for my PhD, there was a professor, and I worked on Victorian literature, so 19th century British literature, and on law literature, all kinds of things. And then, but there was a professor there who specialized in Indian law and literature. So I took the course with her, an independent study with her, and it always remained something. And then on a course I took about fascism and literature, I read Remington Mystery's A Fine Balance. Again, this was in my first year of my PhD, and I wrote a paper about it. And it was the first time I'd heard of the emergency, because one of the really interesting things is that no one has heard of it. I mean, and I was like, what is this period that I haven't even heard of, and no one I know has even heard about it, right? And even in India, it was completely kind of silenced and put away. It has a long, complicated, we're not going to get into that. So
it was silenced, and yet there's so much literature.
That's in the earlier versions of this, right? I write that it was kind of, India is the world's largest democracy. It is. And this was uncomfortably an anomaly. And Indira Gandhi, the great woman leader, So it was shoved aside, but the fiction kept coming back to that. And so I once wrote a paper about India, and then I was asked to write the thing of the emergency because there was nothing. No one had ever written anything about the literature of the emergency. So I was asked to write an article for a book for the Cambridge History of the Indian Novel, because I started doing more work on the Indian novel. And then I wrote with Eitan Bar Yosef from Burgundy University, my friend and colleague. We wrote an article together, but then we realized that there was a lot to say. And then we said, let's write a book. And then he kind of bailed, and I ended up writing the book. No, he remains a good friend. And that's how the book came about. But it came from this, it really just kind of came from itself. I stumbled on this fascinating literature about a period, like there was all this fiction written about, but there were no history books written about the emergency, right? So.
Did any of the books combine the genres?
Yeah. Midnight's Children. Have you read Midnight's Children?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Midnight's Children have all the genres, right?
Right.
So Midnight's Children is famously an allegory,
right?
But it's also often read as an allegory. What I was less interested in Midnight's Children as an allegory, but there's the way Midnight's Children and another novel, Shashi Tharoor's The Great Indian Novel, are rewritings of the Mahabharata, the great Indian, one of the two great Indian epics, right? The Ramayana, the Mahabharata. And I was asking myself, why are they rewriting an epic, right? Why are they writing about the emergency in the form of an epic? So I chose to write about it as an epic.
Okay.
But yeah, so
that was actually the book I was thinking.
Yeah. The Midnight Children. Yeah. And my argument there is about genre. It's not about genre. It's everywhere about genre. It's about gender. It's about gender because, well, I'll just tell you that what I argue there is that both Rushdie and Shashi Tharoor are writing these, and they're trying to go back to the great epic and the great masculine epical hero, right? And to reinsert masculinity into a nation that has been emasculated by this woman prime minister who is also sterilizing men, right? So there's an argument about virility through the epic.
Really?
First of all, this is the wonderful talk. Now, it's absolutely going to read the book. And I find very evocative the emergency and the normalization and the routine. It seems to me it's about India, but of course we can think with it about here and about other places. And really, it seems to me intuitively that the distance is shrinking between emergency and a normalcy. And we saw it very vividly during COVID. The surveillance and care that you alluded to more or less collapsed into one another. We see it in the new wars in Europe, how the integration of immigrants are integrated. Europe has been diverse for a long time. Second, third generation immigrants are French, German, and so on, but they are constantly potential terrorists. And so it's I have to say that it's very evocative.
Yeah, I thank you. I think that there's something about the fact that the emergency is always at our fingertips. And again, we see, that's what I said about today, right? that any moment now we can flip the switch and send the plane to bomb Gaza, and we have our emergency and everything is under control again, right? That we can these emergencies that we think of as something that is force majeure, that we think of it as something that is unprecedented, that we think of as something that is imposed upon us, how I think more and more it has become something that is so easy and wonderful to manipulate. And you know, famously, both India, now not so much, and Israel, right, has been in a constant state of emergency since so the normalization is there, but it is there in that we can always use it, right? Even when we don't use it, right? Are we in a state of emergency when we're not using it, or are we not in a state of emergency? People are, right, even in Israel or in the areas under Israeli rule, different people are under different emergency regimes, right? And that becomes, again, it's completely normalized, and yet it keeps its I don't know what will happen. Or what will happen to its edge. I mean, yeah.
I have a question from
Miri.
First of all, I understand that you try to predict that the current emergency in India that regards the COVID situation will be with negative influence on India, on the democracy of India, based on the historic examples that you gave from the 70s. But although it's different, okay, also your research is, I feel like I don't understand exactly the connection to the current emergency situation in India, because I didn't understand how is it similar to what happened during Gandhi during the 70s, what Gandhi did. Can you please explain how it connects? Because I really lost you there. I understand the examples that you gave on Israel, but I think it's a bit different because India is not Israel, okay? And the emergency, what?
No, I said it's true.
Arguably.
Okay. So if you can explain on this. And second, the books that you gave examples of are literature, right? But several of them are, what are they? Evidence from people that were in jails during the 70s, or is it something else? Because there are a lot of examples of writings from jail that are political letters, like Martin Luther King or Henry Thoreau, that had major influence on the decision makers of the states, King and Thoreau in the United States. And there was also a very famous example of important book that was written in jail, Mein Kampf. I mean, people that are in jail from political reasons, yeah, they have a lot to say against the regime.
They also have nothing else to do.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No Netflix in jail. So the research that you showed us here, it's based on the cognitive procedures that people, that Indian citizens are trying to heal themselves from the emergency state in India, or is it what is it? Why is it a good example to the current emergency now in India?
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you for these questions. I'll make a few clarifications. First of all, there is no official current emergency in India. There is no emergency. There's no state of emergency in India today. And if I implied that, then I'm sorry. What I meant was.
One was 70. Generally,
yes. Yeah. Well, Kashmir is always under emergency, right? I mean, it's complicated, right? What I said was that Narendra Modi's rule today in India is very authoritarian, right? And he and his government are imposing a series of legislation and actions that are severely curtailing Indian democracy, right? And some, not me, but I'll take it, some have called this a state of emergency, an undeclared emergency, right? So it's not that the state has declared emergency, it's doing all the things, right? That was the joke of the cartoon. It's doing all the things that one can do in an emergency, but doing it in legal means by changing the law, okay? And that's why people from the opposition are calling it an undeclared emergency, but there is no state of emergency in India today, okay? That's the first thing I want to clarify. The second thing that I want to clarify, and you said it's not a good example because it's different. Examples are always different, right? Comparisons are always different. It is never the same. The point of looking comparatively, right? Comparison is a complicated tool, but we have to compare because we've got nothing else, right? That's just how our human mind works. We compare, right? So what we need when we're comparing, we need to see what is substantive, what is important, what goes down to the essence of things, right? And then we need to look at the differences when we're comparing. We look at the differences. I didn't say that India is like Israel. India is not like Israel. There are things that are alike. There are things that are not alike. India today is different from India in 1975, which is also different. And yet, there are also these things of similarities. And if you notice, the last part of the talk, I asked as a series of questions. I didn't posit answers. And the reasons I asked posits, as I said, what I understand from India allows me to bring questions to the Israeli context. Not because I'm not, again, like I said to Eli, I'm not interested in classifying. I'm not interested in putting a label. Israel, you are like India, you are put in this box or that box. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what happens once we use the rhetoric of emergency. When people talk about emergency, right? So people in Israel are talking about emergency. We are saying this is emergency. We have to go out into the street. I want to ask what is happening when we say this is an emergency. I also want to ask, and I do ask in the book, what does it mean that people in India are saying this is an undeclared emergency? What are they trying to draw on when they write emergency? Okay, so that's that about examples are always different. The third thing that you asked is about fiction and diary. The book is in two parts. It has 6 chapters, an introduction and 6 chapters. The first 2 chapters are a cultural history where I read non-fictional texts. I read non-fiction, like this diary, like magazines, like all kinds of texts that they're not fiction, right? They're not, well, you might think of as literature, right? So they're non-fictional texts. I read those too. And through them, I write a cultural history and these are all texts that were written during the emergency. Okay? And I do an analysis of them, but I'm a literary scholar. I'm a cultural scholar. I don't read them to get historical information about what happened. but I read them to get cultural information about how these things were understood and experienced and how they functioned in the culture at the time. Okay? So, right, and the diary, and then the other 4 chapters, the other part of the book is 4 chapters, and that's where I write about fiction. Okay, and the first part that I read about Rohinton mystery, that's the fiction part, but it's much longer in the text. But I thought I'd spare you. And then the cultural history part, the diary comes from the cultural history part. In fact, it comes from the introduction. I introduced this through introduction. Now, there are a million. This diary is super short that I read you. Shanta Kumar's diary is super short and the most boring thing you'll ever read in your life, right? He was not a great writer, let's put it this way. He didn't also have anything. Look, this is the problem with administrative detention. The thing with administrative detention is you did nothing to put you in jail, but you want to be a hero. But where does your heroics come from, right? Nothing happens in jail. You did nothing to get into jail, right? But you want to write, so he wants to write this hero. So I found that was an interesting question, which is what kind of rhetoric does he marshal in order to get that emergency to work for him while he's in jail, right? So yes, people write a lot while they're in jail, and we don't need to go to the United States, and we don't need to go to Germany to think of amazing examples. There are amazing prison diaries written in India, even during the emergency. By J.P. Narayan wrote a diary. Other people wrote diaries. You know, there's the famous, beautiful set of letters that Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to his daughter, right? Letters to my daughter. It's letters that he wrote when he was incarcerated. He wrote them to his daughter, Indira, then a teenager, basically, right? And indeed, when the when the emergency started, she incarcerated. They said, yeah, everyone's back in jail writing letters to Indira, right? So that was obviously taken up, right? So there are better examples. But what I was interested in was what he was, I found this diary written by, not a very important, he did have a good political career, but he's not really important politically. But I wanted to see how he was using this rhetoric, what the emergent, right, and the connections back to the colonial, back to this. And also, right, so you mentioned Martin Luther King and Thoreau and all these amazing people. And what I thought you were going to talk about is Gramsci, right? Gramsci, the prison notebooks are maybe the most famous example of like politics and diary. But the thing is that what was also interesting to me, I read this and in the beginning it was just boring, and initially I was just like, here's the freedom fighter incarcerated by the evil emergency, which he was. And then I realized that he was not Gramsci, right? He was not Thoreau and he was not Martin Luther King, but he was a Hindu fundamentalist, right? So what happens, I thought, right, we have our own tropes of the political prisoner as freedom fighter. What happens is the political prisoner is a fighter for the non-freedom of others, right? That was an interesting question to me as a scholar. How do I deal with that kind of? Finally, and I will just say, he said that it has a lot of influence. His diary, as far as I know, I'm probably one of the few people who ever read it in the world, right? I just happened by it. There's no mention it ever anywhere. Finally, I'm not interested in cognitive procedures or how people experience emergency. It's just not what I know how to do, but I'm interested in the way rhetoric is mobilized.
Great. And
thanks, first of all. It's very thought-provoking. I wrote many notes for me. But for you, I only have 2 questions. First of all, I would like to hear more maybe about the translation and cultural aspect of emergency. as you understand it, does emergency in India mean the same thing as we understand emergency, or in the West in general? Because you read translated text, no?
Everything was written in English.
What do you mean?
Yeah. English in India. If you have 10 hours, I can talk about that.
So it sharpens my question. Does the things you read are already accessible to the West in terms of genres that we can translate thriller and I don't remember the other genre we met, but I was wondering if in the Indian local culture there are other genres or other forms of understanding.
Epic, allegory, Indian genres with a long history, right? So realism, not so much, but by the time Rohinton Mistry is writing, realism already has a 100-year history in Indian fiction, both in English and not in English. So I don't see them. These are not, I mean, this is question I get asked all the time in the West, where they're like, oh, but they're writing for us. And I'm like, no, actually not. These are, right, there's a robust literary field in India, obviously, and longstanding. And some of it is in Indian languages, Bangla, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, etc. And some of it is in English, right?
It has long been localized.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, English has. I write a lot about that in the first chapter, right? About the role of English, right? It's also the language of the bureaucracy, right? English is ironically, paradoxically, and this is just like in a nutshell, the language of colonialism has become the neutral language of India, right? Because it is the language that is foreign to all of the Indian states and locales, right? So India becomes, English was supposed to disappear and they kept extending it, but now it's like, so it is very much the language of, it's the language of academia. All universities teach it, almost all, except for some but all. So English is English is the first language, right, of, it used to be the number, it's probably changed, but 40 million Indians. Okay, now, in Indian numbers, that's a very small percentage of the population, right? But you see how, right, whereas people for whom English is their first reading language is about 200 million, 300 million, right? So we're talking about, so, sorry, I got carried away by your language.
Totally answered my question. The second one, more of a thought maybe. I was very interested in the way you said coding an event as an emergency does some sort of depolitization of it. And then I thought that if it does a depolitization to certain events, are there people that resist this depolitization and want to make it politicize this event? Right. And how would we call this genre? Because as I understand the word genre, it's a non-binary form of something. It's not just emergency and non-emergency. With emergency and so what do you think about the other alternative to emergency as a genre? When we need to politicize an event or want to politicize it. I'm thinking about terrorism, for example, right? In Israel, there's a debate. Are everything a terrorism? Is there a Jewish terrorism? You know, the debate around Smotrich.
See, again, that's a brilliant question. It's a brilliant question. It's hard for me to answer because it goes back to Eddie's question, right? About how would you categorize?
I'm not asking how you categorize it. How did you identify other codings?
No, because I think that all of the novels that I read, okay, let me put it this way. I think all of the novels that I read in one way or another are trying to do precisely that. They're trying to decouple emergency from its knee-jerk reaction, from its triggering of, from its depoliticization. They are trying to politicize emergency. In fact, that's precisely what they're trying to do, right? And now that I think of it, right? That's, I keep saying they use genre to intervene in politics, right? They're saying, what do I know? I'm a writer. And what I'm writing is I want to intervene by putting politics back in, right? I'm writing this emergency, but I'm writing it in a way that foregrounds through genre. I use genre to repoliticize emergency. Okay, so even the final novel that I write about, which is just like a thriller, it's like a spy thriller. I don't know how many you've read, not Le Carré, because that's like high-end thrillers, but what's the ones I used to read them in high school?
I've got
The Day of the Jackal. No. Yeah, thrillers like political spy intrigue, blah, 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 good versus bad, right? So there's a thriller. It's set in the emergency. And it's like this complete, it's a blueprint, right? Thrillers, they what's going to happen, but there's the good guy, and the good guy has two girls, the bad guy. And
read them.
Right? And you still read them, and there's intrigue, and there's all kinds of that. And they tend to be very conservative genres, right? Because they send to the deep, right? They accept all the things that there's the bad people, the good people. It's a very Cold War genre, right? And what he's doing there, right? So on one hand, you read it, and it's like this total pulp fiction, right? Conservative, and the guy, but as I read it, I show how he's using it precisely to show the depoliticization that comes from genre. It's a brilliant little book. Again, not a very well-known book. People in India have read it, but
it's not representative of thrillers, as you just described it.
Yes, probably not representative of thrillers. I don't read books for whether they're representative, right? I read them for sort of like the kind of work that they're doing. But it is interesting that all of the emergency novels that I found, all of them ended up doing this repoliticization, which I wish we had talked before I finished the book, because then I could have put that in. That's a really good way of doing it.
Just two small questions.
Yeah.
It's on the sterilization trend that you mentioned in the first publication. So I think that I just regarded from the theory perspective, camps in exceptional situations, they are very, very closely linked together. And if we know about the 1930s situation and also the Guantanamo camp, so is this a narrative that plays a huge role in other publications of this kind?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And in fact, the sterilization is probably the way that the emergency was most sort of written into it, was most remembered by, right? And in fact, many people, one of the things in my second chapter, in the cultural history chapter, I write about sterilization, and I write about the question of the middle class, right? Because sterilization was what separated the very small, very, very small Indian middle class from the lower classes, right? Because the middle class were the subjects and the lower classes were the objects of the sterilization. So whether you were, right, so I write about one of the things sterilization did was that which families were valued and which families were not valued. So there was this rhetoric of the family, Indira Gandhi, mother of the nation, India's Indira, right? Mother of the nation, the bitter pill that they have to, right? So on one hand, there's his family, there's also Indira Gandhi's son, Sanjay, right? So there's all this rhetoric of family, but also this rhetoric of family planning. Remember that sterilization is not called sterilization, it's called family planning, right? This is the family planning plan. So it was very much a common thing, and it was seen as a good thing. And again, it's not like sterilization started in the emergency, not at all. In fact, it started in the early 60s became very important in the 60s. The Ford Foundation, right? That was Americans poured money into India. In fact, after the famine in the late 60s, Americans promised aid in return for numbers of sterilization, right? That was the way the Ford Foundation functioned. That was common practice. That was how it worked. The third world was reproducing too much. That's why India was poor. We needed to modernize, and it was a move from this language of modernization. So, but actually, sterilization was a bit on the wane, and then when the emergency, it kind of got this last great hurrah, but then ended up disqualifying sterilization because it got such a bad name. And people say that Gandhi lost the election mainly because of sterilization.
One additional question. I just remember a talk on a conference last year where an Oxford colleague showed how in the East-West Pakistani conflict, old anti-British poems and folk songs, etc., were instrumentalized in order to create a new enemy. There is something like this also present in the literature you heard, that they use old nation-building narrative.
Absolutely, that's what we see in the diary. That's what we see, especially around prisoners. That was definitely the reunification of colonial anti-British narratives. Yeah, but also a little bit in the literature. Yeah, I mean, it's always there, and the writing in English is always there, and that's always creates this tension.
Any other questions, remarks? So, thanks very much.
Thank you.